I'm Megan Whitmore, 29 years old, and tonight my stepmother raised her champagne glass, smiled that perfect smile of hers, and said, "That's all you deserve, Megan." Her voice cut through the music like glass against stone. Laughter followed, tight, elegant, cruel. My father didn't flinch. He just smiled at her, as though humiliation was part of the celebration. I sat still, my palms resting flat against the linen, the small USB drive in my pocket, pressing against my leg like a heartbeat. They had no idea what I'd brought with me, or how one truth could ruin the picture they'd spent years pretending was perfect. Before I tell you what happened that night, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and tap that like button if you've ever had to stay quiet just to keep the peace. I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina, in a house where silence was a language. My father built his company from nothing, and to him everything had to look flawless. The home, the family, even the smiles. When my mother was alive, the house was warm, filled with laughter and the scent of cinnamon coffee. After she died, the warmth left with her. Months later, Evelyn arrived. Her perfume lingered where my mother's laughter used to live, her heels echoing through the halls like new rules. She knew how to turn cruelty into elegance, how to make cutting words sound like compliments. Everyone admired her. Everyone but me. Haley came with her delicate and golden 3 years younger, but light years ahead in my father's eyes. He said her name so often that I used to count waiting to hear mine once, just once, as proof that I hadn't disappeared. The staff learned quickly that pleasing Evelyn meant keeping their jobs. I learned something else. Stay quiet, stay out of the way. Don't make her look bad. Every family photo had me standing at the edge, smiling half as wide, half as seen. The only thing that felt like mine was my camera. At 16, I saved up from tutoring neighborhood kids and bought a second-hand one from a pawn shop downtown. It was small and scratched, but when I looked through that lens, the world made sense again. I started capturing things no one else seemed to notice, the way sunlight hit cracked pavement, an old woman's hands braiding her granddaughter's hair on a front porch, a dog waiting outside a grocery store for someone who might not return. Those moments were honest, untouched by the kind of polish my father loved. Behind the camera, I didn't have to shrink. I could just see. By the time I turned 18, I had learned how to disappear gracefully. When I told my father I was leaving for college, he didn't ask where I'd live or how I'd manage. Evelyn hosted a farewell brunch that felt more like a networking event than a goodbye. My father wrote a check, slid it across the table, and said, "Call if you need anything." I never did. I built a life that made sense to me. I filmed stories that mattered: veterans rebuilding their lives, single mothers juggling 2 jobs, farmers fighting to keep their land. Through my lens, I found pieces of truth that didn't need approval. But at the end of each project, when the camera turned off, the silence came back. It was the same quiet that followed me out of that house, only now it echoed louder. Then one gray afternoon, an email arrived. "You are invited to Richard Whitmore's 60th birthday celebration. Formal attire, no greeting, no signature, just an address and a time." I read it 3 times, my heart tapping slow and uncertain. It wasn't an invitation, it was a test, maybe even a reminder that they still existed without me. I told myself to delete it, to pretend I never saw it, but something in me refused. After years of being invisible, even a cold acknowledgement felt like proof that I still belonged somewhere. For days I tried to ignore it, burying myself in work, pretending it didn't matter. But late at night in my small apartment, I'd catch myself staring at the glow of my camera charging on the counter, wondering what story it would tell if I pointed it back at my own life. I told myself I'd go just to film some B-roll for a new project, something detached, professional. But deep down, I knew better. I wasn't going there for footage. I was going there for truth. The closer the day came, the heavier it felt. My apartment filled with half-packed camera bags and the hum of old memories I couldn't mute. Every night before bed, I'd whisper, "Just one night, Megan. Go, see what's left." But the truth is, I already knew what I'd find. Evelyn's perfect smile, Haley's polished charm, my father's quiet indifference. What they didn't know was that I was bringing something with me this time, something that could finally make them see the daughter they'd spent years pretending wasn't there. When the morning finally came, I zipped my suitcase, packed the black dress that felt more like armor than fabric, and tucked the USB drive deep into my clutch. The winter air outside was sharp, the kind that makes everything look like a memory. As I drove down the familiar road toward my father's estate, the same iron gates came into view, opening with the same groan they always had. But the house beyond them didn't look as grand as I remembered. It looked smaller, fragile, stripped of the power it once held over me. And as the wind carried the faint scent of roses across the driveway, I realized something simple and certain: I wasn't coming home as their daughter. I was coming back as the one person they'd spent years underestimating. The night of the party, the house looked like a magazine spread strings of silver lights over the ballroom-polished floors reflecting crystal and laughter. It smelled of roses and champagne, expensive and cold. From the top of the stairs I could see everything, the waiters moving in perfect rhythm, the guests leaning close to Richard's stories, Evelyn at the center like she'd choreographed every detail. She spotted me before I reached the bottom step. Her smile was sharp and practiced. "Megan," she said, voice sweet as frosting. "You actually came." I returned her smile, careful, steady. "You invited me." "I suppose I did," she murmured, eyes flicking over my dress. "Try not to make tonight awkward." Her words landed soft, but they cut deep. I had known her long enough to hear what she meant. "Don't remind anyone that you don't belong here." I nodded, pretending it didn't matter, and stepped past her into the glow of the party. Richard saw me soon after, his expression one of polite surprise. "Megan," he said, his voice warm but distant. "I'm glad you could make it. Wouldn't miss it," I replied, though we both knew that wasn't true. He gave a quick nod and turned away to greet another guest. That small dismissal was familiar, the same quiet way he'd always shown me where I stood. I moved through the crowd, my heels silent on the marble floor, the weight of the USB drive in my clutch, a constant reminder of why I was here. Each laugh, each toast, each moment of false warmth pressed harder against me. Evelyn's laughter carried above the music. Haley's, too. Every glance between them was a private victory I wasn't invited to share. I made it through dinner without saying much. The table sparkled with silverware and crystal, but the conversation was hollow, orbiting around business deals and charity auctions. When dessert came, Evelyn leaned toward Richard, whispering something that made him smile. Her hand brushed his arm like a claim. Haley turned to me. "Still doing those little documentaries?" she asked, her tone light but edged. "Yes," I said simply. She nodded, lips curling in a polite smile. "That's nice. It must be freeing to work on something small." I didn't answer. There was no point. In their world, small was the same as unimportant. I took a slow sip of water, steadying my breath. The speeches began soon after. Richard stood tall, thanking everyone for coming, his voice confident and smooth. Evelyn's toast followed, flawless and calculated. She spoke of partnership, of legacy, of gratitude. Not once did she say my name. When the applause rose, I felt the air tighten around me. As people began to dance, I slipped away, my heart beating too loud. The hallway was dim, lined with portraits of my father shaking hands, smiling beside awards, framed symbols of everything he'd built. I found his office at the end, the same heavy oak door that had once been forbidden. Inside the room was still polished desk, neat stacks of papers, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air. I set the USB drive on his nameplate and stood there, letting the quiet settle around me. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something older years of holding things in. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was trespassing. I felt like I was reclaiming space that had always been mine. The click of the door behind me made me turn. Richard stood there, his expression unreadable. "Megan," he said softly, "Evelyn said you'd stepped out. You shouldn't be in here." "I know," I replied. "I just needed a quiet place." He hesitated, then walked in, closing the door behind him. The lamplight caught the lines on his face, familiar, weathered, distant. "You look like your mother," he said after a pause. "She used to stand in this room the same way, like she was looking for something." I held his gaze. Maybe she was. He looked away, uneasy. I reached for the USB and slid it across the desk toward him. "You should see this," I said, "before anyone else does." He frowned. "What is it?" "The truth," I said simply. He sighed, the sound heavy and skeptical, but he sat down. The faint glow from his laptop reflected in his glasses as he plugged in the drive. The video opened automatically. Lena had stitched it together perfectly. The first voice was Evelyn's, calm and certain. "Once the transfer is approved, Richard won't notice a thing until it's done." Then Haley's laugh, light and careless. "He'll probably thank us for taking some of the pressure off." Another voicemail, unfamiliar. "You're sure no one else has access to the files?" Evelyn again. "Only us. Megan doesn't even know where the company keeps its books. She's too busy chasing broken people with her little camera." The room went still. My father's hands froze over the keyboard. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing until the clip ended. When the screen went black, the silence felt heavy enough to crush the air between us. "Dear God," he whispered finally. His voice was thin, almost fragile. I stood motionless. He rubbed his forehead. "You could have ruined us tonight. Why didn't you—" "I wasn't trying to ruin anyone," I said quietly. "I just wanted you to see what's real." He looked up, eyes searching mine as if seeing me for the first time in years. The tension in his shoulders eased. Slowly he reached across the desk and rested his hand on mine. The gesture was hesitant, but it was real. "I see you now," he said. Something inside me unclenched, something that had been waiting a very long time. He closed the laptop, picked up the USB, and said, "Stay here." When he left the office, I followed at a distance, the murmur of the crowd growing louder as he stepped back into the ballroom. The music faltered when people noticed him. Evelyn looked up from her conversation, smile automatic. "Richard," she called, "is everything all right?" "Not yet," he said. She blinked, confused. "What's wrong?" He held up the USB. "You tell me." The room stilled. Haley's laughter faded mid-sentence. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Evelyn's smile flickered, her fingers tightening around her glass. "Richard, what is this supposed to mean?" "I watched it," he said. "Every word." The color drained from her face. Haley's expression collapsed into something close to fear. "Dad," she began, but he stopped her with a look. "Don't." His voice was steady now, controlled but cold. "You both treated my trust like something you could spend." Evelyn stepped forward, her tone softening. "Richard, she's manipulating you." He pointed toward me. "She's my daughter, and she just saved what's left of this family." The silence that followed was unbearable. Even the music seemed afraid to return. Evelyn's lip trembled, the mask finally breaking. Haley looked down, blinking hard, searching for something to say. Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out 2 envelopes. He set them on the table beside the untouched cake. "One is for the divorce," he said quietly. "The other ends your employment with the company. You'll both need to find somewhere else to live." Evelyn's voice cracked. "You're choosing her over us." He shook his head. "I'm choosing honesty." No one spoke. People shifted uneasily, pretending not to stare. I didn't move, didn't smile. There was nothing triumphant about the moment, only truth bare and undeniable. Richard turned toward the door. "Megan," he said, his tone final. "Let's go." We walked through the open doors, past stunned faces and murmured whispers. The night air outside was sharp, cutting clean through the perfume and noise. Gravel crunched under our shoes as we crossed the driveway. For once, the silence between us didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Halfway to the car, he said softly, "I used to think protecting people from pain was love." He paused, eyes fixed on the dark sky. Turns out it was just fear. I didn't answer. Some truths don't need a reply. The engine started, and the house behind us began to fade, the lights dimming against the night, like a memory finally letting go. The night after the party felt like something out of a dream, silent, heavy, and strangely hollow. My father and I drove through the back roads outside Raleigh without saying much. The headlights stretched across empty fields, and the only sound was the soft hum of the tires on asphalt. Every so often I'd glance at him, his hands steady on the wheel, his jaw set, his eyes fixed ahead. The man who once measured success in balance sheets and dinner parties now looked like someone seeing his life for the first time stripped bare of illusions. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost careful. "I don't know if I can ever make it right," he said. I didn't have an answer. The truth had already done what it came to do. It had burned through everything false, leaving only what was left between us. He dropped me off outside my apartment just after midnight. The city lights flickered against the windshield as he parked at the curb. He turned to me, his face unreadable but softer than before. "Thank you," he said quietly. Then almost as an afterthought, "I'll call you." I nodded and stepped out into the cool air, the door closing behind me with a sound that felt final and unfamiliar. Inside my apartment, everything looked the same. The half-packed camera bags, the mug from that morning still on the counter, but I wasn't the same person who had left for the party. I stood there for a while, still wearing the black dress, staring out the window at the city that kept moving, as if nothing had changed. Over the next few days, messages from my father came slowly. A short text. A call that didn't last long. He sounded tired, but clearer than I'd ever heard him. The divorce was in motion. Evelyn and Haley had moved out and the company board had been notified. There was no press release, no statement, just quiet dismantling. Raleigh was small enough that whispers traveled fast. I heard from an old acquaintance that Evelyn had tried to sell jewelry to cover her legal costs, and that Haley's name had disappeared from every company roster within a week. I didn't ask for details. The truth had already taken care of itself. Still, silence has a way of finding its shape. In the weeks that followed, it filled the spaces I didn't expect: mornings without calls, nights without noise, moments that used to belong to anger, now replaced with a kind of emptiness I couldn't name. I tried to bury myself in work, filming a local story about a community garden built on an abandoned lot. The people there were kind, their hands calloused, their laughter genuine. It should have grounded me. Instead, it made me feel like I was watching life happen from behind glass. One evening, Lena came by with takeout and a bottle of wine. She dropped her coat over a chair, eyeing me as she unpacked containers on the counter. "You've been quiet," she said. "I've been editing," I replied, but we both knew that wasn't the whole truth. She leaned against the counter, arms folded. "You did what you had to do. You exposed them. That should feel good." "It doesn't," I said after a pause. "It just feels done." She nodded, her expression softening. Sometimes that's all it needs to be. We ate on the couch, the city's noise fading to a low hum outside. At one point, Lena reached into her bag and pulled out something small, a folded photo from years ago. It was of the two of us at a street fair, me holding a camera, her laughing mid-sentence. "You've been telling everyone else's stories for so long," she said quietly. "Maybe it's time you told your own." Her words lingered long after she left. That night, I opened my laptop and stared at an empty project folder. For years, I had filmed people surviving, rebuilding, reclaiming, starting again. I'd never thought to turn the lens inward. The idea felt both foreign and necessary. A few days later, my father called again. This time, his voice carried something lighter. "The house is going to be sold," he said. "I'm not staying there." "Where will you go?" I asked. He hesitated. "I'm not sure yet. Somewhere quiet, I think. Somewhere that doesn't echo." We didn't talk long, but when the call ended, I sat there thinking about what that meant for both of us. The mansion had been more than a home. It was a symbol, one we had both lived under, even from different worlds. Letting it go felt like closing the last chapter of a story neither of us had chosen. A week later, I drove past it one last time. The for sale sign swung gently in the wind, the front gate standing half open. The driveway where I once waited for approval now looked ordinary, almost small. The windows were dark, the rooms beyond empty. I parked by the curb, engine running, and stayed long enough to see the sun catch the edge of the roof. It was strange how quiet endings could be. That night I started filming again, not for a client, not for work, but for myself. I set the camera on the windowsill, hit record, and just let the world move. Cars passing below, a couple walking hand in hand, a child pointing at something only they could see. There was no plan, no script, just life unfolding the way it always had, indifferent and beautiful. Weeks turned into months. The footage grew. My father's updates came less often, but steadier, the way small streams lead quietly to something larger. He'd found a cabin near a lake, he said. Nothing fancy, just trees, water, and silence. You should come by, he added once, as if unsure whether it was an invitation or a hope. I said I would. I meant it. When I finally packed the car, spring had arrived. The air carried that faint green smell of new leaves. As I drove toward the lake, the roads narrowed, trading city noise for the soft hush of pine forests. The cabin appeared through the trees, small and weathered, with smoke rising from the chimney. My father was on the porch, a mug in his hand, wearing an old sweatshirt instead of a suit. He smiled when he saw me, an easy, unguarded smile I didn't recognize at first. You found it, he said. I followed the silence I answered, and it made him laugh. Inside, the place was simple. One-room shelves lined with books, the faint smell of coffee and cedar. He poured a cup for me, black and strong, and we sat on the porch watching the water move. The quiet wasn't heavy anymore. It felt full, like something breathing. We didn't talk much about the past. There wasn't anything left to explain. The mansion was gone. Evelyn and Haley were names that no longer carried power. The company had new leadership. The world had moved on, and so had we. Later that evening, the sun dipped low, turning the lake gold. My father glanced at me and said, "You know, I watched one of your films again, the one about those women rebuilding after the floods." He paused, his eyes on the horizon. "I used to think I was protecting you by keeping you out of things. Now I see I was just keeping you small." I looked at him, unsure what to say. He didn't need forgiveness, and I didn't need to give it. The quiet between us said enough. As the last light faded, a loon called across the water, its echo carrying through the trees. For the first time in years, I felt completely still, not trapped, not waiting just there. And somewhere deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. The story that had started with betrayal wasn't about revenge after all. It was about beginning again in a place where silence no longer meant absence, but peace. The mornings at the lake came softly. Light filtered through the pine trees, touching the porch in thin gold lines. My father would already be awake by the time I stepped outside, a mug in his hand, the air crisp enough to see our breath. He didn't talk much, and I didn't need him to. Sometimes the silence between us felt like an old language we'd both finally learned to understand. I stayed with him for a few days, helping clean out boxes from his storage room. The house was small, but filled with traces of his past, a drawer of cufflinks, a framed photograph of my mother, a cracked trophy from some forgotten company award. Each object felt like a piece of the man he'd been trying to bury. When he found a file folder labeled Whitmore Holdings, he stared at it for a long moment before handing it to me. "You should keep this," he said quietly. "It's just paper now, but it's part of where you came from." I took it, the weight of it light, but the meaning heavy. In the afternoons, I'd walk along the lake trail with my camera, recording the sound of the water against the dock, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of geese. My lens had always been a way to control what I saw, but lately it felt more like a way to connect. The world wasn't something I needed to frame perfectly anymore. It just needed to be seen. A week after I returned home, Lena stopped by the studio with a new canvas under her arm. She always smelled faintly of paint thinner and coffee. "You're glowing," she teased, setting the canvas down. "Must be that lake air." I smiled, shaking my head. "It's just quieter there." We spent the afternoon catching up. She told me about an art collective she was joining, and I showed her rough clips from a new project I'd started, a documentary about women who'd rebuilt their lives after being overlooked or dismissed. Lena watched quietly, her expression soft. "You're in this one, aren't you?" she asked. I hesitated. "Maybe I said." She nodded, as if she already knew. That night, as I edited footage, an email came through from a local paper. The subject line read, "Inquiry, Whitmore Family Story." My first instinct was to delete it, but something about the sender's name, Daniel Reese, made me pause. He was a journalist I'd met briefly years ago at a charity gala, back when Evelyn still ruled every room. The email was short and polite. He said he'd heard about the company scandal and wanted to write a follow-up, not gossip, but a piece about truth-telling accountability and the cost of silence. I read it twice before closing my laptop. For a long time, I just sat there, the soft hum of the city outside my window. Part of me wanted to ignore him, to keep what happened between my father and me where it belonged, in the quiet. But another part of me knew the story was bigger than us. It wasn't just about betrayal. It was about how families hide behind perfection until the truth finally refuses to stay buried. The next morning I called him. His voice was calm, careful. "I didn't expect you to respond," he said. "Most people don't." "I'm not most people," I replied. We met at a small cafe downtown, the kind with chipped mugs and low jazz playing in the background. Daniel was older than I remembered, but there was a steadiness to him. He didn't ask intrusive questions. He listened. When I finished recounting what had happened, how Evelyn and Haley had plotted how I'd found the files, how my father had finally faced them, he sat back thoughtful. "You didn't just expose them," he said. "You changed the story's ending." I wasn't sure what to say. The truth was I hadn't done it for headlines or justice. I had done it because silence had cost me too much already. When the article ran 2 weeks later, it wasn't sensational. It was honest. It focused on integrity, on the quiet courage it takes to confront what others pretend not to see. My name wasn't in the headline, but people knew. Messages began appearing in my inbox, some from strangers, others from women I'd filmed over the years. They thanked me for sharing, for giving them permission to speak. My father read it too. He called that evening. "You handled it better than I ever could," he said. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. "I'm proud of you, Megan." I don't remember what I said in response, only that I stood by the window after we hung up, watching the city lights blink on one by one. Somewhere inside, a weight I'd carried for years began to shift. As spring deepened, I spent more time filming again. The project I'd started took shape, a series of portraits of women who'd found their voices after years of being ignored. I called it The Quiet Ones. Each story was small but powerful. A teacher starting over after divorce, a widow building a bakery from scratch, a daughter forgiving a mother who never could. Through their stories, I saw pieces of myself reflected back, women who had learned that truth doesn't need applause to matter. One afternoon, Daniel stopped by the studio with coffee and a notepad. "I wanted to see how it's coming along," he said. I showed him rough cuts, and he watched in silence, tapping his pen against his knee. When it ended, he looked at me and said, "You're not just telling stories, Megan. You're preserving them." His words stayed with me. I didn't realize then how much they'd matter later. That night after he left, I opened a small wooden box I kept on the shelf. Inside was the old USB drive, the one that had once held all the proof I needed. The metal had dulled over time, fingerprints etched into its surface. I held it for a long while, remembering the night of the party, the way my father had said, "I see you now." That single moment had changed everything. The next morning, I took the drive with me to the lake. The air smelled like rain, and the water moved in slow, steady ripples. I sat on the dock, turning the USB in my hand until the metal caught the light. Then quietly, I dropped it into the water. It sank quickly, vanishing beneath the surface without a sound. There was no ceremony, no audience, just a sense of peace. Some truths don't need to be held forever. Sometimes it's enough to know they existed. As I stood, I saw my father through the cabin window, reading on the porch, unaware of what I'd done. I smiled faintly and walked back toward the house. That evening over dinner, he looked up from his plate. "I've been thinking," he said. "Maybe it's time I visit the city for a while. I'd like to see where you work." I nodded. "You'd like it there," I said. He smiled. "Maybe I just want to see what peace looks like when it grows up." The room went quiet again, but it was a good quiet, the kind that feels alive. Outside, the crickets started their song, steady and sure. Somewhere in that rhythm, I realized how far we'd come. The story that began in a house full of lies was finally finding its way toward truth. And the truth, as it turned out, wasn't loud or cruel. It was steady, like water finding its level, slow, patient, unstoppable. My father kept his promise and came to the city that summer. When I met him at the station, he stepped off the train in jeans and a windbreaker, no briefcase, no watch. For a moment, I didn't recognize him. The man who once measured time in deals and deadlines looked lighter, as though he'd traded perfection for peace. He hugged me awkwardly, almost shyly, and said, "I hope I packed right. I haven't done this in years." The weekend passed quietly. We walked through my neighborhood shared takeout at the park and talked about things that had nothing to do with money or family. He asked questions about my work, about the stories I was filming, about what I wanted next. For once, it didn't feel like an interview. It felt like a conversation between two people who were learning how to belong to each other again. That evening, I took him to the small theater downtown where my latest documentary was screening. The lights dimmed and the room filled with the sound of women telling their stories about rebuilding after loss, about being overlooked and choosing to start again anyway. I watched his face more than the film. Every so often I saw him nod or press his lips together, and I knew he understood. When the credits rolled, the audience clapped slow at first, then stronger. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him wipe his eyes with the back of his hand. He didn't say much on the way home, just reached over once to squeeze my shoulder. That small gesture was worth more than any apology. The next morning, I found him sitting on my balcony with coffee watching the city wake up. "You know," he said, his voice low, "your mother would have loved what you're doing." I didn't say anything. The mention of her felt like sunlight through fog, familiar and distant all at once. After a moment, he smiled. "I wasn't much of a listener back then. You got that gift from her." We spent the rest of the week exploring little places. I loved the bookstore near the park, the diner that served coffee strong enough to keep you honest. Sometimes he'd fall quiet looking at something ordinary, a child running after pigeons, a couple, arguing gently over a map, and I could tell he was seeing the world differently now. On his last night in town, he looked around my apartment, his hand resting on the back of the couch. "You've made a home here," he said softly. "You didn't need me to." I shook my head. "Maybe not, but I still wanted you to be part of it." He smiled, then tired, but content. "I'll do better at that." After he left, the days settled back into rhythm. I returned to work editing The Quiet Ones with Lena's help. The project had grown into something bigger than I'd planned, an exhibition with photographs, interviews, and short films. One afternoon, while I was adjusting sound levels, Daniel stopped by the studio again. He had a box of pastries in one hand and that same easy grin. "Peace offering," he said. "I might have mentioned your documentary in an interview this morning." I laughed. "Might have?" He shrugged. They asked about stories that stayed with me. We spent the afternoon going over footage, his notebook open on his knee. He had a way of listening that made silence feel safe. When he spoke, it was never to fill space, it was to understand. Somewhere between conversation and quiet, I realized how different this felt from every connection I'd had before. It wasn't built on need or performance. It was built on truth. As summer turned to fall, the exhibition opened to a full room. People stood shoulder to shoulder studying the portraits and listening to the voices of the women I'd filmed. Their stories played softly on a loop, weaving through the space like music. My father stood near the back, hands in his pockets next to Daniel and Lena. When I walked over, he gave me that same proud look I'd seen at the theater. "You did this," he said simply. After the crowd thinned, Daniel offered to help close up. We gathered cables and folded banners until the room was empty again. The floor was covered with footprints and bits of paper, remnants of something meaningful that had passed through. He handed me a clipboard and said, "You know, Megan, you could take this on the road, show it in other cities." "Maybe," I said. "I think I'd like that." He smiled. "Then do it. Don't let it sit still." That night when I got home, I sat by the window, watching headlights move along the street below. The world outside felt bigger, more open. I thought about how far I'd come from that dinner table years ago, how silence used to be my armor, and now it was simply space for new beginnings. A few days later, I went back to the lake to visit my father. The trees had begun to change, red and gold reflected across the water. The cabin looked the same, but there was warmth to it now, a coffee mug on the railing, a flannel draped over a chair. He greeted me with a hug and said I started something new. Inside, I found his desk covered with notebooks and a laptop open to a blank page. "I've been writing," he explained, "about the company, the mistakes, the lessons. Maybe no one will read it, but I need to say it somewhere." I nodded. "That's what stories do. They make room for the truth." We spent the evening sitting by the fireplace, the air thick with the smell of pine and wood smoke. At one point, he turned to me and said, "Do you ever think about forgiveness?" I looked at the firelight dancing across the walls. "Sometimes. But I think it has to come after understanding." He nodded slowly, as if turning that over in his mind. "Then I guess I'm still learning." Later that night, after he went to bed, I stepped outside. The air was cool and still, the sky full of stars that shimmered like a quiet audience. I thought about everything that had led us here, the betrayal, the confrontation, the years of distance. None of it had been erased, but it no longer defined us. When I returned to the city the next morning, Daniel called. "How was the lake?" he asked. "Peaceful," I said. "Like the world slowed down." "I'd like to see it sometime," he said. "Maybe you will." As I hung up, I realized something had shifted. For years, my story had been about surviving the noise other people made: Evelyn's polished cruelty, Haley's careless entitlement, my father's silence. Now, for the first time, the quiet belonged to me. Outside, the city pulsed with morning light. People hurried past with coffee cups and briefcases, unaware of the small revolutions happening inside others. I opened my window, letting the air fill the room, and whispered, "It's enough." Somewhere a new story was beginning, one not built on revenge or loss, but on what remained after both had faded. The kind that starts slow, steady, honest. The kind that feels like coming home. The first snow arrived early that year. It dusted the city in silence, softening everything sharp. I was sitting by the window when my phone buzzed a message from Daniel. "Lunch, I promise real food, not pastries this time." I smiled and texted back a simple, "Yes." We met at a small cafe near the studio, the kind that smelled like cinnamon and coffee grounds. He looked tired but content, his hair dusted with snowflakes he hadn't bothered to brush away. We talked about work first. His latest feature had gone viral, and my film was getting invitations from festivals out of state. It should have felt like success, but beneath the small talk there was something heavier. "You've been quiet lately," he said after a while. "Everything all right?" I hesitated, stirring the foam in my cup. "My father hasn't been well. Nothing serious, but he's different lately. Tired." Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. Maybe all that change caught up with him. The words stayed with me long after he left. That evening I called my father, expecting his usual calm voice. Instead, there was a long pause before he said, "Megan, I've been thinking about the company. There's something I never told you." His tone carried a weight that made me sit up. There were deals Evelyn handled near the end, ones I didn't oversee. They weren't just unethical, they were illegal. The room felt suddenly smaller. I could hear the faint crackle of his fireplace on the other end of the line. "Do you still have proof?" I asked. "I found enough," he said. "But if I report it, there'll be fallout. People will question everything. It won't just touch her, it'll reach me too." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he added softly, "I spent years hiding behind appearances, pretending everything was fine. Maybe it's time I stopped pretending." That night, I barely slept. The snow outside kept falling endless and quiet, like the world was starting over. By morning, I had made a decision. I packed my camera and drove back to the lake. The road was slick. The trees bowed under the weight of snow. When I arrived, my father was standing on the porch, bundled in a thick coat, a folder clutched in one hand. Inside, the fire burned low. He set the folder on the table, and I saw what it held: old contracts, emails, letters bearing company seals. "If I take this to the authorities," he said, "it'll reopen everything. Evelyn will face charges, maybe prison. Haley, too. But the company name, it's still mine." I looked at him carefully. "You built it. You can rebuild it with honesty this time." He nodded, but his eyes carried a quiet fear. "That's what I'm afraid of, Megan. That maybe I'm too late for rebuilding." We spent hours going through the documents, my camera rolling quietly in the background. I wasn't filming to expose him. I was filming to remember to capture the moment a man decided truth was worth more than reputation. When he finally picked up the phone to call his attorney, his hand trembled, but his voice didn't. The process that followed moved slowly. Statements, meetings, official letters. The news broke a week later. Former Whitmore Holdings CEO exposes corruption tied to ex-wife and partner. It was everywhere: headlines, interviews, opinion pieces. Some praised his integrity, others questioned his motives. Through it all, he stayed silent, spending most of his days walking by the lake. One morning I found him sitting on the dock, wrapped in a scarf, his breath visible in the cold. "I keep thinking about what she said that night," he murmured, "that I'd never notice. And she was right. I didn't. Not until you made me look." I sat beside him, the wood cold under us. "You saw when it mattered." He smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on the frozen water. "You remind me of your mother when you say things like that." The following weeks blurred into a rhythm of quiet work and public noise. The investigation expanded. Evelyn's name returned to the headlines, this time linked to fraud. Haley left the country, no one knew where. My father gave one final statement, then refused every interview request that followed. He said enough truth had been spoken for one lifetime. Daniel reached out during that time, checking in every few days. His messages were simple, short notes that somehow steadied me. "Hang in there. Proud of you both." One night he called. "How's he holding up?" "He's stronger than I expected," I said, "but it's taking a toll." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "You know," he said softly, "there's something remarkable about the way both of you chose truth over comfort. Most people never get that far." I didn't answer, but I thought about it long after we hung up. By February, the case had reached its end. The final verdict cleared my father of criminal involvement, but left no room for pride. The company's assets were divided, its reputation gone. When the official letter arrived, he placed it on the mantel without opening it. "That's the past," he said simply. "Let's leave it there." A few days later, I returned to the lake for one last visit. The snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of brown grass beneath. My father's cabin looked smaller, somehow worn, but peaceful. Inside, he was packing a small bag. "I'm going to stay with an old friend in Oregon," he said, "someone from before all this." He glanced at me, smiling gently. "I think it's time for a different kind of quiet." We sat together on the porch until sunset. The air smelled of pine and thawing earth. I wanted to say something profound, something that could capture everything we'd survived, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he reached for my hand and squeezed it once. "You gave me my life back, Megan. Don't forget to live yours." When I drove away that evening, the road curved through the trees, the lake fading in the mirror. The snow had turned to rain by the time I reached the highway, tapping softly against the windshield. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was thinking about what I'd learned, that truth doesn't always destroy. Sometimes it clears enough space for something new to grow. Back in the city, I found an envelope waiting on my doorstep. Inside was a postcard from my father mailed before he left. On the back, he'd written, "Found the ocean. It's louder than I remembered. Don't forget to rest." I set it on my desk beside my camera and stood by the window. The streets glistened under streetlights, the world still moving forward. Somewhere out there, a new chapter was already forming, quiet, uncertain, honest. And for the first time in years, I felt ready for it. By spring, the city had begun to bloom again. The trees along the sidewalks were full of pale pink blossoms, and the air smelled faintly of rain and new beginnings. Life was returning to its rhythm, projects, meetings, quiet evenings. But everything felt different now. I could feel the space my father's absence left, not as an ache, but as something calm and full. He was living somewhere near the coast now, where mornings started with the sound of waves instead of phones ringing. We talked every Sunday. His voice sounded lighter, unhurried. One afternoon, I was in the studio reviewing footage when Daniel stopped by. He leaned against the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You've been buried in there for hours," he said. "Come up for air." I laughed softly. "You know some of us have deadlines." "Some of us," he replied, handing me a cup. "Just need lunch." We walked to the park, the kind of place where the city noise faded into birdsong. We found a bench near the pond, and for a while we didn't say much. The silence between us had grown comfortable, like the pause between breaths. He looked over at me and said, "You know, your story changed a lot of people." I shook my head. "It was never supposed to be my story." "It always was," he said. "You just didn't know it yet." There was something in the way he said it, steady, certain, that made my chest tighten. For months, I'd poured myself into work, afraid of what might fill the quiet if I slowed down. But in that moment, sitting beside someone who had seen both the damage and the healing, I realized maybe the story wasn't just about survival. Maybe it was about learning to stay. When I got home that evening, a letter was waiting on my doorstep. The handwriting was my father's. Inside was a single line, "Found peace here. You were right about the truth. It doesn't scream, it whispers." Folded inside the letter was a small photo. He was standing on a beach at sunset, the ocean behind him, his smile unguarded. I held it for a long time before setting it beside my camera. Over the next few weeks, life found a gentle momentum. The Quiet Ones was accepted into a national film festival, something I had dreamed about for years. Lena helped me prepare the prints, adjusting lighting and color with the same precision she used in her paintings. "This one," she said, pointing to a still frame of an older woman looking into the camera, "feels like the heart of it." She lost everything I said and still called it a beginning. Lena smiled. "So did you." The night of the screening, the theater was full. People filled every row, whispering as the lights dimmed. I sat near the back, hands folded, heart steady but full. The film played, each story unfolding in quiet honesty. When my own segment appeared, just a short voiceover about learning to see myself clearly again, I felt the room grow still. The applause that followed wasn't loud or wild. It was slow, deliberate, sincere. Afterward, Daniel found me in the lobby. "Congratulations," he said, his eyes warm. "That was something else." "It feels unreal," I admitted. "Then maybe it's real enough," he replied. As we stood there, I caught sight of someone I hadn't expected to see, Haley. She was standing near the exit, wearing a simple coat, her hair pulled back. For a second, I wasn't sure it was her. Then she turned and our eyes met. The noise of the crowd faded. She didn't approach, didn't wave, just held my gaze for a moment before slipping out into the night. The encounter stayed with me. It wasn't anger I felt anymore, or even resentment. It was something quieter, like closing a door gently instead of slamming it. I didn't tell my father. Some things I decided didn't need to be reopened. A few days later, Daniel and I took a drive out of the city. He said he wanted to show me something. The road wound through the countryside until it opened onto a cliff overlooking the ocean. The water below was rough, foamy waves breaking against the rocks. He parked the car and said, "I come here when I need to think." The wind was sharp, pulling at my hair. I stood at the edge, the sea stretching wide and endless below. "It reminds me of him," I said. "My dad. The way the world keeps moving no matter what you lose." Daniel nodded. He'd like this place. We stayed until the sky turned gold. Before we left, he reached into his jacket and handed me something small, a smooth stone shaped by years of water and time. "For your collection," he said. "I don't have one." He smiled. "Start one." Back in the city, I placed the stone beside my father's photo. For the first time in a long time, my apartment didn't feel like a stop between storms. It felt like home. In the months that followed, I finished another film, smaller, more personal. It wasn't about justice or redemption. It was about grace. The night it premiered, I received a message from my father. He had watched it online. "Proud of you, kid," it read. "You taught me what truth looks like." Later that night, I stood on my balcony, the city lights flickering like distant stars. The air was warm, the kind that holds a promise of change. Somewhere below, a street musician played a slow tune on a harmonica. I closed my eyes and let the sound carry me. There was no grand ending, no final reckoning, just a steady, quiet peace that had taken years to earn. Justice hadn't arrived in fire or fury. It had come like dawn, soft, patient, undeniable. When I opened my eyes again, the city felt different, lighter, like the weight of the past had finally lifted, leaving only space for whatever came next. And somewhere in that stillness, I knew the story wasn't about revenge at all. It was about recognition, about finally being seen and choosing to stay visible. The next morning, the city felt unusually still. Sunlight spilled through the blinds, washing my walls in soft gold. I sat at my desk, the postcard from my father resting beside my camera, the stone Daniel had given me beside it. They both seemed small, ordinary things, but together they told a whole story, the one I had spent years trying to live, not just survive. Later that day, I received a call from my father. He was by the ocean again, the sound of waves filling the line. "I saw the article about your film festival," he said, his voice calm and clear. "You've done something real, Megan. Something that will last longer than any company or name." I smiled, tracing the edge of the postcard with my thumb. "You sound happy." "I am," he said simply. "For the first time in my life, I am." We talked about small things after that: the weather, the seagulls that kept stealing his lunch, the book he'd started writing about his years in business. Before we hung up, he said, "Keep telling the truth, kid, even when it's quiet. That's when it matters most." After the call, I went for a walk through the park near my apartment. Spring had finally taken hold, flowers pushing through the soil, children chasing each other near the fountain, the world shaking off its winter weight. It reminded me how time has a way of moving forward, even when we don't feel ready. A week later, Daniel and I met for dinner at the same cafe where we'd first talked about the story that changed everything. The lights were dim, the music soft, and for once we didn't talk about work. He asked how I felt now that the dust had settled. I thought for a moment before answering. "Lighter," I said. Like I finally put something down I didn't realize I'd been carrying. He nodded. Maybe that's what healing looks like. We finished our meal in quiet comfort. Before we left, he reached across the table, his hand resting over mine. "You know," he said, "your story didn't just change your father's life. It changed mine too." I didn't ask how. I didn't need to. Some truths don't need explanation. They're understood in the silence between words. That night when I returned home, I stood by my window and looked out over the city. The same skyline I'd once felt lost beneath now felt like part of me. My reflection in the glass looked different, stronger, settled. I thought about the girl who used to sit in her father's house, half seen, half heard, and wondered what she'd think if she could see this moment. Months passed quietly after that. My father sent another postcard from Oregon where he'd decided to stay. Lena's art show sold out in 2 days, and she started talking about opening her own studio. Daniel and I began planning a small trip along the coast to film stories from the people who lived there, fishermen, families, those who'd built lives on simplicity and resilience. It felt like the right kind of work, the kind that didn't just capture truth, but honored it. One evening as I was packing my camera gear, I found myself staring at an empty shelf where the old USB drive used to sit. I didn't miss it. The truth it once carried had already done its work. What mattered now was what came after the quiet peace that grows once the noise is gone. Before I went to bed, I opened my journal and wrote a single line: "Revenge fades, but honesty stays." It wasn't something I planned to publish or share. It was just for me a reminder that justice doesn't always come with fireworks or applause. Sometimes it arrives in whispers, in steady hearts, in lives lived truthfully after the damage is done. The next morning, I stood on my balcony watching the sunrise. The city stretched awake below, full of stories unfolding in quiet corners. Somewhere out there, someone was learning what I had, how truth can break you open just enough to let the light in. And maybe that's the real ending, the one I'd been writing toward all along. Not the collapse of a false world, but the steady creation of a better one built on peace, forgiveness, and the courage to start again. If you've ever walked away from people who refuse to see your worth, I hope you know this. You didn't lose. You began. And the life waiting on the other side of truth, it's worth every step. So tell me where you're listening from tonight and share your story if you feel ready. Because when we speak our truth, no matter how quiet, it has a way of finding those who need it most.